Have you ever sat in a well-lit room, yet felt surrounded by darkness? Not the kind of darkness that comes with the night, but a heavier, quieter shadow. A weight that settles not on your shoulders, but somewhere deeper, behind the eyes, beneath the skin, wrapped around the heart. It doesn't announce itself with thunder or storms. It just arrives, slowly, silently, and then suddenly, it's everywhere. You look around at your life, your job, your family, your health, and by all accounts, everything seems fine. But inside, there's a silence so loud it drowns out the world. A sadness with no name. A fatigue that sleep can't fix. A fog that won't lift, no matter how bright the sun outside. Perhaps you've felt this. Maybe you feel it right now. And if you do, you're not alone. Because centuries ago, a man named Al-Ghazali felt it too. In his book, Deliverance from Error, he writes of a time when he stood at the edge of a spiritual abyss. Not because he was poor, or lost, or unloved, but because something inside him was breaking. Quietly, daily, he said, I plunged into this vast ocean of doubt and fear. I searched for the truth in every direction. But the more I searched, the more I drowned. This wasn't the crisis of a man without faith. It was the breakdown of a man who had built his life on the wrong pillars, and suddenly saw them crumble. He wasn't losing his mind. He was meeting it, for the first time. Have you ever woken up and felt like the air is heavier? Like your own reflection is a stranger? That you no longer know why you're doing what you're doing, or who you're doing it for. This isn't madness. This isn't weakness. It's a form of awakening. A painful one. It's your soul finally knocking, after years of silence. Al-Ghazali didn't give us easy answers. He didn't wrap his pain in pretty words. He described the storm. He sat with it. He let it undo him. And from that undoing, he found something most of us are too afraid to look for: truth. What if the darkness you're feeling right now isn't a curse, but a calling? What if it's not the end of the story, but the moment the real story begins? How many times have you gone through your days smiling on the outside, while something inside you quietly screams? How many nights have you laid in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling like you're not really here? Like you're living a life you don't remember choosing? This is not weakness. This is not failure. This is the soul's way of waking you up. Al-Ghazali stood at that same edge. And he didn't leap. He listened. And in that listening, began his return. At first, the silence was terrifying. When Al-Ghazali withdrew from the world, its titles, its praise, its noise, he was met with something most people run from: himself. No distractions. No applause. No roles to play. Just the raw, unfiltered sound of his own soul. And that sound was not peaceful. It was full of questions. Of regrets. Of buried voices he had silenced for too long. The voice that asked, "Why are you living this way?" The voice that whispered, "Is this who you really are, or just who the world told you to be?" He realized then what many of us discover too late, that the most painful truths are the ones we hide from ourselves. Have you ever noticed how we fill every silence with noise? Music, scrolling, talking, working, anything but sitting quietly with our own thoughts. Why? Because silence can be brutal. In silence, the masks fall off. In silence, the real questions surface. Al-Ghazali didn't find healing in running. He found it in stopping. He paused the performance. He stepped out of the roles. And in that pause, he began to feel things again. The sadness, the guilt, the confusion, the longing, all the emotions he had buried under years of being strong, of knowing the answers. He once wrote that the beginning of healing is not knowledge, but honesty. And honesty is terrifying, because it means admitting that you're lost. That you don't have it all together. That maybe, the person you've been isn't the person you're meant to be. But what if that moment of unraveling is not the end? What if it's the beginning of something truer? Ghazali's healing didn't come in loud breakthroughs. It came in whispers. It came in slow mornings where he allowed himself to feel sadness without fixing it. In quiet afternoons where he stopped pretending to be okay. He began noticing things he'd ignored for years. The way his body felt when he breathed. The tension he carried in his chest. The voice that always told him to be better, try harder, don't show weakness. And slowly, those voices began to fade. In their place, a new voice emerged, his true self. Not the scholar, not the teacher, not the leader, just the man who was tired, the man who had questions, the man who wanted peace more than praise. This is not a story of spiritual conquest. It's a story of spiritual surrender, of letting go of who the world says you should be, to become who you truly are. And that journey doesn't start in grand gestures. It begins in silence. There is a kind of silence that isn't quiet. A silence so loud, so heavy, that it feels like it's pressing on your chest. A silence not around you, but inside you. Not the absence of noise, but the drowning of your true voice under the rubble of years. This is the silence Al-Ghazali came to understand, not in the deserts, nor in libraries, but in himself. And not in his brilliance, but in his breakdown. He stopped speaking to the world so he could hear what was buried beneath the noise. Not the sound of his thoughts, or the logic of his arguments. Something far subtler, a whisper, a rustle, a breath of something true that had been ignored for far too long. It was never about silencing the world. It was about finally silencing the inner critic that had been tormenting him. The one that said, "You must always be strong." The one that whispered, "You are only as worthy as your accomplishments." The one that judged every feeling, every doubt, every cry for help as weakness. He let that voice grow quiet, not by force, not by violence, but by stillness. By letting it speak until it ran out of things to say. And in that sacred stillness, something else began to emerge. At first, it wasn't even a voice. It was a presence, a memory, a trace of the person he used to be before the world told him who he should be. It came slowly, timidly, like a child peeking from behind a door. A self long forgotten, gentle, curious, uncertain, but deeply alive. It didn't shout. It didn't command. It simply asked, with aching honesty, "Do you remember who you are?" That question did not demand an answer. It asked for listening. In our world, we are taught to always be doing, solving, explaining, fixing. But some wounds do not heal by action, they heal by attention. Some truths do not arise through arguments, they surface through silence. In the hush of his inner world, Al-Ghazali began to hear feelings he had buried, fears unspoken, longings denied, parts of himself he had abandoned in the pursuit of perfection. He realized he had worn so many masks for so long, he forgot the shape of his own face. He was the scholar, the teacher, the theologian, the debater, the man who must know. But who was he when no one was watching? Who was he when he stopped performing? There is a kind of exhaustion that sleep cannot cure. It comes from living a life that is not truly yours. That is the darkness he had spoken of, not the absence of light, but the absence of self. And this is where the true healing began. It wasn't dramatic. There were no revelations from the sky. No sudden transformation. Just a slow, quiet returning. To breath. To honesty. To stillness. To what had always been there, waiting. He started to write again. But differently. No longer to prove. No longer to impress. But to understand. to listen, to respond, not to others, but to himself. Even the act of writing became an act of prayer. He wrote not answers, but questions. Not conclusions, but confessions. And somewhere in the lines between words, he met himself again. That is what silence does. It strips away the layers until only the essence remains. This was not a new Ghazali. It was the old one, the forgotten one, now uncovered like a treasure beneath ruins. And what he found was not certainty. It was not strength. It was not the illusion of control. It was humility, a softness, a willingness to be broken and yet still walk. A willingness to ask without knowing if answers would come. He no longer feared his doubts. He held them like fragile birds, understanding that they, too, belonged. He no longer punished himself for feeling. He let the sorrow rise, and he let it speak. The tears that once felt like weakness now felt like purification. He had cried for others. He had cried for loss. But now, he cried for the self he had silenced. That is a different kind of tear. Not of sadness, but of reunion. And through those tears, a new strength emerged, not the strength to conquer, but the strength to be soft. The strength to be truthful. To be fully human. In the silence, he heard something even deeper. A voice that did not come from him, yet felt more like him than anything else ever had. A voice that said, "You are not alone." A voice that did not need language. A voice that was closer than breath. Call it the soul. Call it God. Call it love. It was not loud. It was not rational. But it was real. And it had been waiting all along. Sometimes healing doesn't look like rising from the ashes. Sometimes it looks like learning how to sit with the ashes and breathe again. After the silence came the slow reassembling. Not a transformation, not a reinvention, but a quiet, gentle reconstruction, piece by piece, without the masks. Al-Ghazali didn't suddenly become someone new. He began allowing himself to be who he had always been, without performance. And that is far harder than it sounds. Because when you've spent your whole life being what the world expects, the act of simply being yourself feels like rebellion. He began making choices that looked small on the outside, but were massive on the inside. He stopped forcing a smile when he felt sadness. He stopped pushing through exhaustion just to maintain the image of strength. He stopped drowning in activity just to avoid the presence of his own soul. And in that stopping, something new emerged, a space. At first, the space felt like emptiness. Lonely, unfamiliar, frightening. But slowly, it became fertile ground. A space where he could feel without judgment. Where he could listen without reacting. Where he could exist without proving. He called it truthfulness. But not truthfulness to others. Truthfulness to himself. It wasn't dramatic. There was no crowd to applaud. No clarity from heaven. Just a morning when he woke up and chose not to pretend. That was the beginning. When no one was watching, and he could have slipped back into his roles. He chose not to. When he could have escaped into distractions. He chose to be still. And in that stillness, the weight began to lift, not all at once, but enough to breathe. He let the tears come when they came. He let the questions linger without answers. He let his heart speak, even if his mind didn't understand. This was not weakness. It was the courage to live without the armor. And perhaps the greatest act of bravery was choosing not to run from himself. You see, healing is not becoming better than you were. Healing is becoming yourself. Without the masks, without the noise, without the borrowed expectations. It is remembering who you were before the world told you who to be. And for Al-Ghazali, that meant shedding the layers. The layer of the great scholar. The layer of the perfect believer. The layer of the unshakable intellect. Even the layer of healer or guide. He didn't abandon these roles. He just stopped worshiping them. He stopped making them the measure of his worth. He gave himself permission to be human, to be flawed, to be tired, to need, to not know. And in doing so, he began creating a new kind of life. A life that wasn't measured by achievements or applause, but by honesty, by alignment, by peace. He began planting seeds, quiet ones, moments of sincerity in his day, a pause before reacting, a breath before speaking, a soft no when his soul whispered that yes would be a lie. He allowed moments of stillness in between the noise. And in those moments, he began to see the world differently. Not as something to conquer, but as something to walk through gently. Not as a place for performance, but as a mirror for reflection. Even the people around him began to feel the shift, not through sermons or lectures, but through his presence. There was a softness now, a gentleness that came from no longer hiding. Because when you drop your masks, you give others permission to drop theirs too. He wasn't trying to fix anyone anymore. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He had nothing left to defend. And from that place, he could finally love. Not from need, not from ego, but from truth. He could finally rest, not just physically, but spiritually. Because the rest we truly seek isn't sleep. It's the rest that comes when you no longer carry the weight of pretending. When you can sit with yourself, and feel no need to escape. That is the real peace. And that peace does not come from outside. It comes when you stop running from the inside. Al-Ghazali learned this not by climbing mountains or memorizing books. He learned it by listening, by sitting, by daring to live without the applause. And in doing so, he discovered something most people never do. That the soul doesn't scream. It whispers. And you can only hear it when you finally become quiet enough to listen. Maybe peace was never lost. Maybe it was only buried beneath the noise, the masks, the years of pretending. When Al-Ghazali walked out of the darkness, he didn't do so with answers. He carried no grand revelation, no perfect doctrine, just a quiet knowing, one earned in silence, through struggle, through surrender. He had looked into the mirror of his soul and didn't turn away. That was enough. You see, healing doesn't always feel like healing. It feels like confusion. It feels like emptiness. It feels like standing in the ruins of your old life, unsure whether to rebuild or walk away. But in those ruins, something sacred can grow. Not despite the storm, but because of it. Al-Ghazali's wisdom wasn't in the books he wrote. It was in the courage to stop performing. It was in the moment he dared to say, I don't know who I am anymore. And instead of covering that with noise, he listened. And then, he planted. Like a gardener tending to soil that once held weeds, he planted with care. A moment of stillness here. A pause of breath there. A small, sincere prayer that didn't ask for anything, only presence. Over time, those seeds took root. He didn't rush the process. He didn't force the bloom. He simply returned, again and again, to that quiet space inside. That's where the healing happened. And maybe, that's where it's always been happening. Not in breakthroughs, not in victories, but in the decision to stay with yourself when you would rather run. The world teaches us to seek peace in achievements, in titles, in possessions, in being seen. But what if the peace you're searching for lives in what you're avoiding? What if it's not something to earn, but something to remember? What if the soul has always known the way home, but we stopped listening? That's what Al-Ghazali discovered, not through triumph, but through surrender. He learned that truth isn't loud. It doesn't compete. It simply waits for the silence. And in that silence, you meet yourself, not the version shaped by fear or expectation, but the self that has been whispering all along. I'm still here. That's the garden after the storm. It's not perfect. It still rains. But now, you know how to sit in the rain without drowning. You know that darkness comes and goes. That emptiness isn't always a curse. That stillness is not absence, but presence in its purest form. And most of all, you know you're not broken. Just buried. And your healing isn't in becoming someone else. It's in uncovering who you were, before the world told you to be someone else. So ask yourself, can you be brave enough to sit with your silence? Can you turn off the noise, even for a moment, and listen? Not to your fears, not to your roles, but to that fragile, beautiful voice that trembles inside you and says, I miss you. That's your soul speaking. And if you listen, if you really listen, you might just find what Al-Ghazali found. That the peace you thought was gone was waiting for you to come home. It was there when you cried alone at night. It was there when you questioned everything. It was there when you stood on the edge of collapse and didn't fall, but paused. Not to be strong, but to be real. And in that pause, a new world opened. A world where your worth isn't measured by how much you carry. A world where your pain is allowed to breathe. A world where you don't have to be anything other than what you are, tired, healing, human. This is the world Al-Ghazali returned to. Not a world of answers, but a world of honesty. A world where the self is not an enemy to fix, but a companion to understand. And he didn't return to preach. He returned to remind us that even in our darkest hour, we are not alone. Because someone else has walked through the same storm, and left a light behind. Maybe that's all we ever needed. Not someone to fix us, but someone to say, I've been there too. So if today you feel the weight, if today the silence is too loud, if today you don't recognize the person in the mirror, let that be the beginning. Not of pretending, not of striving, but of listening. Maybe the darkness you fear is not a prison, but a womb. Maybe what you're feeling is not the end, but the start of something sacred. Maybe your soul is calling you home. And maybe, just maybe, this time, you're ready to answer. Because perhaps the truth is this. The darkness was never meant to break you. It was sent to awaken you. And perhaps, just perhaps, it wasn't a curse after all. It was a quiet invitation to return to the heart you've forgotten. And finally, rest.